natural and the eternal laws of the universe. Somewhere the Protestant theologian Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. What is racial segregation but an existential expression of man's tragic estrangement, his awful separation, his terrible sinfulness? And so we must solve this problem not merely because it is diplomatically expedient, but because it is morally compelling. This is the great challenge facing America. Now, in order to do it, in order to solve the problem, we've got to develop massive action programs all over the nation. This problem will not work itself out. We must work at it on a day-to-day and hour-to-hour basis. Now, to develop this kind of action program, we've got to get rid of one or two myths that are constantly disseminated around our nation. One is the myth of time. Now, you've heard this, I'm sure. There are those people who contend that only time can solve the problem. And they say to the Negro and his allies in the white community, just be patient, don't push things too fast, and if you wait 100 or 200 years, time will work it out. But I think there's an answer to this myth, and it is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I hate to say that I'm absolutely convinced that the forces of ill will of our nation, the forces committed to negative ends of our nation, the extreme righters of our nation, have often used time much more effectively than the people and the forces of goodwill. And it may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people who will bomb a church in Birmingham, Alabama, but also for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so we must help time, and we must realize that the time is always right to do right. Now, that is another notion that gets around a great deal. It is the idea that legislation really doesn't have a role to play. It can't really solve the problem. You've got to change the heart. We hear this all over the country, that you've got to change the heart, and you can't change it through legislation. Well, I would say that there may be some truth in this, that you can't change the heart through legislation at that moment. I may go along with that argument. But I would have to go on to say it may be true that you can't legislate integration, but you can legislate desegregation. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law can't make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. So while the law may not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men. And when you change the habits of men, pretty soon the attitudes and the hearts will be changed. And so that is a need for strong legislation constantly to grapple with the problems that we face. Right now, a civil rights bill dealing with voting being debated in the Congress of our nation. And I think this is one of the most important bills facing our nation today. This bill came into being as a result of our movement in Selma, Alabama, a movement articulating the longings and aspirations of the Negro people of the Black Belt for freedom and for the right to vote. This movement dramatized the issue so much that the President of our nation, backed up, I'm sure, by the vast majority of people of our nation, came forth calling for new civil rights legislation to guarantee the right to vote. But there are forces right now in the Senate seeking to emasculate that bill. They're seeking to do it already. They're seeking to hold on to the poll tax and not bother that. They're seeking at points to bring in other amendments which will give us another weak bill. And I think all people of goodwill must mobilize our resources and say to the Congress of our nation that we must have a voting bill this time, which will end the need for a voting bill any time in the future. The right to vote must be guaranteed for every citizen of our nation, and every obstacle must be removed, even the poll tax, which still exists on the state level in Texas, in Alabama, in Mississippi, and in Virginia. Legislation is necessary to grapple with this problem, and certainly to grapple with the employment problem, to grapple with the housing problem. We need strong legislation, and it is sad indeed that there are trends in our country which reveal to us that many of our white brothers have not come to the point of being willingly living next door to a Negro. And so we know of Proposition 14 in California, and I think there must be on the part and certainly in the attitudes and certainly in the minds of people of goodwill, a determination to do away with these obstacles to brotherhood in community and neighborhood living. This reveals, too, that we have a long, long way to go. Now, in all of our work and all of our activities, our movement must be undergirded with a philosophy. And I'd like to say just a few words about the philosophy, the undergirding philosophy, which is non-violent resistance, which is guided and which has undergirded our movement all of these years in the South and over the nation. First, I am convinced that this method is the strongest method available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom and human dignity. I'm absolutely convinced that if the Negro succumbs to the temptation of using violence in his struggle, unborn generations will be the recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness, and our chief legacy to the future will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos. But that is another way, and it is this way of nonviolent resistance. And this method has a way of disarming the opponent. It exposes his moral defenses, it weakens his morale, and at the same time, it works on his conscience, and he just doesn't know how to handle it. If he doesn't beat you, wonderful. If he beats you, you develop the quiet courage of accepting blows without retaliating. If he doesn't put you in jail, wonderful. Nobody within a sense loves to go to jail. But if he puts you in jail, you go in that jail and transform it from a dungeon of shame to a haven of freedom and human dignity. Even if he tries to kill you, you develop the inner conviction that there are some things so dear, some things so precious, some things so eternally true, that they are worth dying for. And if a man has not discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live. The nonviolent movement gives an individual the capacity to stand up against an evil, unjust system without violence, without hatred in his heart, but willing to risk even his life in order to give witness to the truth as he sees it. Another thing about this method is that it makes it possible for you to struggle and yet maintain an attitude of active goodwill toward the perpetrators of the old order. I guess this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the nonviolent discipline when it goes over to the area of talking about loving people.